what is it that I really want out of sport? What is it that I really want out of life? Me personally, I think we're seeing this prevalence of doping in the age grouping because a lot of people now injecting prescription drugs into your life, and we're finding new ways to solve problems and help people.
Hello and welcome once again to the TriDoc podcast. This is episode 153, coming to you on September the 5th, 2024. And I'm your host, Jeff Sankoff, the TriDoc, an emergency physician, triathlete, triathlon coach, and multiple Ironman finisher, coming to you as always from beautiful, sunny Denver, Colorado. It was about 12 days ago, on the day that I am releasing this episode, that the Ironman Canada event, both 70.3 and full distance races, took place in Penticton, British Columbia for the final time. Unfortunately, as was the case over the last couple of years, this event is kind of snake bit, where we have seen cancellations because of forest fires over, the last 2 years. We had a cancellation because of the pandemic when the race was first supposed to come back in 2020. And this year, of all things, the swim had to be canceled because the water and air temperatures were simply too cold to allow for the swim to be held safely. It is so unfortunate that a magnificent locale, the host of a race that dates back almost 35, maybe 40 years in the Ironman lore, has had to deal with such an ignominious kind of conclusion that we have seen as we did here in this case. Penticton is really a spectacular location to have such an event, and I am really sad that it is going to no longer be anymore on the calendar. It was the first Ironman that I did back in 2004, and I know for many others, it holds a very special place in their hearts and their memories. We will look forward to a new event that's coming in Ottawa next year. Hopefully that one will have more success and staying power. We have seen Canadian Ironmans kind of go the way of the dodo recently. We had the race in British Columbia at Whistler. That itself replaced the race in Penticton, but Whistler did not succeed. Now the race went back to Penticton, and now Penticton is gone. Mont Tremblant was a very popular Ironman race for many years, but unfortunately that too did not seem to have the same capacity as it had in years past, and now only the 70.3 is being held every June. So will the Ironman in Ottawa be more of a success? Well, it's kind of a twist on the Ironman brand for this kind of event. It is an in-city kind of race, not something that is really done all that often on the Ironman circuit, and Ottawa is a pretty spectacular city to have such a race. It's already sold out as of this recording, and of course, the first year that these events happen, it's not that surprising that that would happen. What the proof will really be in whether or not this continues to be a sellout on an ongoing basis. Now, Ottawa is a great draw. It's a lot quicker for people to get to than Mont Tremblant was, where you had to fly into Montreal and then drive for 2 hours. You can actually fly right into Ottawa. It's got easy connections from Toronto or Montreal, making it very accessible. It's also very easy to drive to from a lot of Ontario and the northeastern United States. So I'm optimistic for one that Ottawa is going to prove to be a really successful race, one that people are going to enjoy, and one that will have staying power. Time will tell. We can hope and I would think anticipate that a Western Canada Ironman will be in the making. The question will be, where will it be? Will it be somewhere like Edmonton? Will it be maybe in Victoria, where Victoria has a very successful 70.3 race? Who knows? Time will tell. If there's an appetite for another Ironman event, and certainly I would think there would be in the western part of the country, I imagine that one will show up in the next year or two. We'll see. What do you think? Is Ottawa likely to be a successful Ironman event? And would you like to see something else in the western part of the country? Drop me a line, tri_doc@icloud.com, or put your comments in the private TriDoc podcast Facebook group. If you're not already a member, please do search for TriDoc Podcast on that platform. Answer the 3 very easy questions. I'll gain you admittance, and you can put your comments there about Ironman in Canada or elsewhere, as well as any questions that you might have that you're interested in hearing answered on the medical mailbag. On the show today, we are going to be dedicating the entire program to the subject that we will be discussing on the medical mailbag. This is a question that came to me from a very popular person in the world of triathlon, a former guest on this podcast, Triathlon Joe Wilson. Joe is a competitive age grouper and, like me, has for a little while been a little bit concerned about some of what we perceive as shenanigans going on in the age group ranks. And this past summer, there was a media report coming out after the Challenge Roth that suggested that doping is a significant problem within the age group members of our triathlon community. A study that was done by researchers that polled 800 of the participants in that event found that fully 11% of them admitted to using some kind of performance-enhancing substance, be it for physical or cognitive doping. So what does this mean for triathlon? What does it mean for the individuals who are using these agents? Well, on the medical mailbag, Coach Juliette Hochman and I are going to discuss both the physical and long-term potential medical issues that are associated with doping, and we'll also get into a little bit of what doping means to us as triathletes who are competitive in our age groups. We're also going to discuss whether or not triathlon has to have a kind of reckoning with this problem, or if it's really much ado about nothing. We're also going to have a couple of guests that are going to come on and discuss this subject with us, and I think that you will find it to be interesting and thought-provoking discussion that we are going to have over the course of the next 45 minutes or so. I'm pretty sure you're going to find something in it that is going to resonate, and as always, I welcome your feedback about any of your thoughts on this subject. So please do become part of the conversation because this is a big issue in our sport. Before we get to that, I want to take my customary moment to thank all of you who have decided that for about the price of a cup of coffee per month, you would like to join the group of individuals, the group of listeners who are Patreon supporters of this podcast. Patreon supporters have decided that they get a lot out of this program and they would like to help support it by pledging their financial support and help the podcast stay on and also continue improving technically hopefully auditorially as well. Patreon supporters get access to bonus episodes that come out about once every month or so, and those who decide to sign on for $10 a month also get a thank you gift in the form of a pretty cool BOCO TriDoc podcast running hat. So if you're not a Patreon supporter but are interested in learning more about how to become one and what's involved, please do head over to my Patreon site, which is www.patreon.com/TriDoc podcast. And as always, you have my thanks in advance just for considering. It's time for a special edition of the Medical Mailbag. This Medical Mailbag is going to basically take up the entire episode of this TriDoc podcast. So for this, as always, I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Coach Juliette Hochman. Juliette, welcome back.
Thank you. Good to be here.
We are going to be talking about doping in sports, specifically doping in triathlon. And this comes about as a direct result of Triathlon Joe Wilson, who reached out to me about a month ago. He contacted me and wanted to know if I had seen an article that he came across that talked about a survey that had been done after the Challenge Roth. And it was quite an alarming survey. I had not seen it, but he brought it to my attention. I took a look at it, and I had my intern, Cosette Rhodes. She did dive into the medical literature and found some supporting evidence. And so we wanted to talk about doping in triathlon. Juliette, what is or what has been your experience, or at least your sort of perceptions of doping in triathlon as an age grouper?
So we've actually talked quite a lot about this offline, and I think you and I have slightly different experiences. I think that, as you have mentioned before, we both had the great fortune and also, I would like to think, result of a lot of hard work of being a little bit on the pointy end in the last few years in terms of age group podiums. And you've commented to me a few times about your suspicions that some of your competitors in your age group and perhaps age groups around you are using testosterone or perhaps other performance enhancers. I don't worry about that at all. On the female side, I don't think about it at all. It doesn't affect me at all. But from time to time, And this is also true for a good friend of ours who is the age group below me, who has a similar build. From time to time, I'll get a stray comment thrown here and there, either social media or, at a banquet, one of those awards banquets or whatever, about the way that I'm built, being a little bit leaner. No wonder, whisper, etc. I wonder what she's doing, etc. And I know that we have a mutual friend who has had a similar experience, which is just so disheartening because you work incredibly hard, you do all the right things, and then you do well. And instead of people immediately just thinking, wow, what a great model for the way that can all come together, it's a suspicion that perhaps you're doing something wrong, illegal, immoral, etc. And so I think you and I come at it from different places, but it's still the same issue.
Yeah, and I think that we offer an interesting different perspective. So here I am as a man in my late 50s, working really hard, dealing with a lot of the things that we all do as we get older, with difficulty in recovering, being able to train at the same level as we used to, and showing up at races and often seeing the fruits of my labor, but then seeing other people around me who just have these times that just seem so incredible. And on the one hand, sometimes they're competitors that I have known for many years and I've seen their track record, and it's easy for me to understand, oh, that person is just always been great and good for them. They're amazing. But sometimes it's people that don't have such a track record, and I often will scratch my head. And on your side, I think you are the person who's at the top. And so is our friend who's in the age group below. We actually have two friends who are in the age group below, but one of them in particular who really wins her age group just like by the same margins that you do. And I think what happens is because there is this vacuum where there's just no testing whatsoever. And then you see these articles like the one we're going to discuss that suggest that there really is a pretty significant number of age groupers who are willing to take things to enhance their abilities, then people fill in the blanks. And I've asked in the past, I've gone on Slow Twitch, which I will admit is not really a great sample for the average triathlete. It attracts a very specific type of person. But I have put a poll question on there in the past and asked, if people are worried about this, how many of you would be willing to pay a little bit extra in your registration fee to pay for better drug testing? Because right now there's really nothing in age groupers. I have won my age group 3 times. I have been on the podium probably 10 or 15 times. I have not once been drug tested. I don't know. Have you ever been drug tested?
No, never been drug tested.
Yeah. And the friend that we were referring to, she has been drug tested, but only in ITU events. And I'm not surprised by that because ITU has the tie to the Olympics. And so I think they probably have a more stringent kind of program. But none of us have been tested. And I'd welcome it because if I was being tested, then I know that other people are being tested. And in the absence of testing and with the understanding that there is a number of people who are abusing the absence of testing and taking things because they know they're not going to get caught, then when people see these results, they're going to cast aspersions. As I said, I did this poll. I asked people if they would be willing to pay a little extra, $5 to $10 extra on top of the registration. And uniformly, the answer was yes. And I was talking with Michael Erickson recently on his podcast, and he wondered how many drug tests that would pay for. If you have 2,000 people in an event and you charge $5 to $10 per person, that's a lot of drug tests. You don't have to do that many. Test the winners of every age group, test a random sample of people, just pull them aside at the finish and say, hey, you've been randomly selected. We're just going to do a drug test. And yeah, it's not inexpensive. It doesn't cost nothing, but it wouldn't be impossible to do. There are ways to come up with a solution. And I worry, especially as we have this conversation, we'll come back to this at the end of this conversation, but I worry that the credibility of the sport is potentially at risk here. So let's talk about what we found. So we'll begin with this study that was done at Roth. And it was, I want to be very clear, this is a study that has not yet been published in the medical literature. This is a study that was done by researchers at a university, but so far the results have only been made public through the media. So we have to scrutinize that through a bit of a lens. We have to understand that it's not been peer reviewed, and therefore we have to be a little bit careful with how we interpret it. Nonetheless, these same researchers have done a previous study that showed similar results, and we'll get to that other study in a second. But this particular study surveyed 800 of the athletes. At least I got 800 athletes to answer their questions, and it was fully anonymized. And so I don't have a breakdown of men versus women. I don't have a real breakdown of ages or anything like that. But basically, they asked two questions. Have you knowingly taken agents to improve your physical performance in endurance sport? And these agents, and they went on to specify, these agents can only be obtained from a pharmacy, from a physician, or on the black market. And then it went on to list the agents as, in other words, things like anabolic steroids, testosterone, EPO, growth hormone, etc. And answering that question in the affirmative was 11% of athletes, which is a shocking number as far as I'm concerned. That's just an astonishing number. And then there was one athlete who was actually interviewed as part of this whole media story. His name was Jens. He shows how he gets his EPO. He shows how he injects it. He has no qualms about it. He does it because he believes that professionals are doping, and why shouldn't he? It was a little bit sensationalized. It's hard to swallow, but I keep coming back to this sort of question of why. We're doing this for fun. I enjoy training as much as I enjoy racing. If I have a bad day at a race, it doesn't take away from my training. I've never understood the psychology of doping, certainly when you consider that doping has risks. You were an Olympian. You rode. You have a lot of experience, not personally doping, but being surrounded by dopers from other countries. Do you have any sense? Obviously, at the Olympics, other story about why people dope.
For sure. And I guess that if I'm looking at the possibility of people doping in age group triathlon, I just don't care. I don't, as you said, none of us are paying our mortgage based on our race winnings in age group triathlon. And while I think it undermines the beautiful possibility of clean sport, and it's a bummer, I love training and I love racing, and I'll do this until I can't walk up the stairs anymore. And I don't know why people are doing this. In the 80s, when I was rowing, I rowed on the 1988 Olympic team. And as all of you remember, the Berlin Wall came down in 1990, and that was very much the end of the Eastern European system as we knew it. We knew then, and so much has come out since then about particularly the East Germans and their doping factory. It's really awful and shocking and tragic what those athletes had to go through. But I knew even as a 20-year-old that East Germans and much of the Eastern Bloc was doping, and that was the only way they were allowed to stay in the system. It was dope or out. And they were taking something called turinabol, which turned women into men and men into women. And it was just crazy reading about what it did now. But even as a 20-something, I knew that those people's lives were better under that system because they were employed. They got to travel internationally. Their families got taken care of. Their parents got a job they wanted. They had better housing. I can't understand what that choice looks like. I'm not going to, and there was nothing I could do about it. And so I did never let it bother me. And yeah, at the Olympics in 1988, we came in 6th in the women's 8, and the 5 countries ahead of us were all Eastern Bloc countries, every single one of them. And so it was, but again, it never bothered me because I couldn't do anything about it. And those athletes were making decisions that I've never had to be faced with in my life. And so fast forward however many years, decades, and sure, the situation is different, but it's a little bit the same in that I don't know what's going on in these athletes' lives that they feel like they have to take this to prove to themselves or others that they're better people because they look a different way, or they maybe do a little bit better in a race, or I don't know, maybe they believe their spouse is going to love them more if they podium. I have no idea. I'm not in their shoes. So I don't think about it a lot. I don't worry. It doesn't occupy any space in my brain. I think
it's a wonderful perspective. And I think that I think you're correct. I just can't. I don't race to win. I race because it's part of my lifestyle. It's part of who I am. It just so happens I enjoy winning, so it's nice to do well.
Yeah, we all like winning. Sure.
But with that said, I show up, I do my thing, and I don't worry about whoever else is there and whatever happens. And if I end up 10th on the day and there were 9 people better than me, then I accept that because, as you said, I'm out there doing the thing I love. And I did everything I could to have the day that I had and I want to be sure that when I leave, I am feeling happy and positive. And so I'm not going to pay any attention to the possibility of whether or not this is going on. But it's still unfortunate that it's going on because I wish it wasn't, not just because I think it raises question about the credibility of the sport, but also because people are putting themselves at risk. And I think you raise an excellent point about we don't know what's going on in people's minds and lives that makes them make these decisions. But, and I'm sure, well, never mind, but I'm sure that even if they knew the potential downsides, they probably wouldn't change anything. They probably still would do this.
It's hard
because
to tell.
Right? Yeah.
I mean, the toll on those Eastern Bloc athletes is awful. And that was much more systemic and over long periods of time and this higher dosages and et cetera. But, oh my gosh, cancer, heart disease, so many things that happen to those athletes. And again, hopefully that's not the same level of severity with age group triathletes. But yeah, it does cause health risks, as we know.
Yeah, they were guinea pigs, right? Those Eastern Bloc athletes, they were really guinea pigs. And that's not the case with athletes. Age group athletes generally are taking significantly lower doses of whatever they're taking. EPO's the big one. So let's just run through. We found a paper, Doping in Sport, Effects, Harm, and Misconceptions. I think this is a really useful paper because it gets into what are the agents that people commonly use and whether or not they actually do have evidence that show that they help, and also what are the downsides. We'll start with anabolic androgenic steroids. These are most classically testosterone, but there are others. And I think the important thing is that testosterone is widely used as it is because it's become widely available through men's health clinics and a variety of other reasons. Basically has not ever been shown to improve endurance. It doesn't improve your VO2 max. It doesn't improve your lactate threshold. All it does is improve your muscle mass and improve your strength. Now, with that said, I think you and I both agree. We always proselytize on the importance of strength training.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
I find it hard to believe that if you didn't have a higher testosterone level, that you wouldn't have some benefits.
Sure. I can see that. Yeah.
I think
Go ahead.
No, I just think you're going to recover better. I think that I think that cycling, running does necessitate some strength. I think you're going to be more resistant to injury. So while your actual endurance performance may not improve, I think that the sort of serial improvements you're getting, like running alongside your endurance, shall we say, I think is going to give you some benefits.
Sure. Makes sense. Yeah.
Now, what are the downsides? We know that people who take anabolic steroids are at risk for significant cardiovascular complications. This includes sudden cardiac death. You can get cardiac enlargement, including dilation of the heart. You can get cardiac fibrosis. So there are some very significant cardiac issues. And you don't have to look far for this, right? Professional wrestlers who are widely known for using anabolic steroids in their 20s, 30s, they're all dying, unfortunately, in their 40s and 50s of cardiac events. And it's generally related to the use of anabolic steroids, which is really tragic. The next common and related thing that people will use is growth hormone. Growth hormone has been shown to, again, have no significant effect on VO2 max. It does, however, result in an increase in fatigue and muscle pain. A decrease in fatigue and muscle pain after exercise. So you could imagine that it would have some benefits there. It can result in some pretty significant downsides. It can result in long-term effects that are not truly understood at this point, but it's not been studied as well as the anabolic steroids. So there's no long-term consequences, health consequences that are really known. Insulin and insulin-like growth factor are sometimes used by weightlifters and other kinds of resistance athletes, but not really used in endurance sport. It's a very dangerous thing to take. It's taken because it's an anabolic type of hormone. It results in the buildup of protein and muscle mass and things like that. But if it's taken, it can result in death from hypoglycemia. So it's not something that would be used by endurance sports athletes. EPO is the big one. That is short for epogen or erythropoietin. Erythropoietin is a hormone that is secreted by the kidneys and results in an increase in synthesis of blood mass. It is taken by athletes who want to increase artificially the amount of circulating hemoglobin they have, and it has been shown to significantly improve endurance performance because of an artificial increase in oxygen carrying capacity. However, has to be done very carefully, because if you go too far, and we've seen this in professional cyclists who have doped with EPO in past decades, where they have died because they end up with a blood that is too thick. It ends up clogging their small arteries in their brain, in their heart, and in their organs, and it can cause significant problems. Then we get into some other things that you've probably heard of, beta-adrenergic agonists, such as salbutamol, which is used for asthma. It's questionable whether or not it actually has significant beneficial effects. It's been used. Chris Froome his name has been bandied about as someone who's used this. He does have asthma, but he sometimes has been found with higher amounts than are purported to have been related to his asthma. Nonetheless, whether or not beta agonists actually improve endurance performance, the jury's out on that one. So a variety of things that people can take, and then there's a whole host of other things I'm not even going to get into. This doesn't even touch the cognitive doping, which we're going to talk about in a few seconds, because there is a whole host of other things. But there are things that people take. A lot of them cause downsides. And I mentioned that that study from Roth was not peer-reviewed. There is a similar study that was done, and it's the prevalence of legal performance-enhancing substance use and potential cognitive and or physical doping in German recreational triathletes assessed via the randomized response technique. A mouthful of a title. Yeah. And it doesn't really follow my title writing school, because it didn't tell you what you needed to know, which is what did they find?
Yeah.
Basically, what they found was they did a similar survey. Again, the questions were very specific. Did you take something to enhance your physical performance? And they added a question here. Did you take something to enhance your cognitive performance? Now, when I talked, again, I was on Michael Erickson's podcast, Triathlon Show, which is a very popular science-based podcast on triathlon. And he took exception with my referencing this study because he felt that cognitive doping accounts for a lot of doping, and he felt that that includes caffeine. It is true, caffeine can be thought of as a cognitive doping supplement. However, this study specifically did not mention caffeine. This study, when it asked about cognitive doping, it said substances that are obtained, again, in a pharmacy on the black market with a prescription, and listed substances like cocaine, amphetamines, methylphenidate. This was very specific, did not talk about caffeine. And the numbers here were 7% admitted to using an agent for physical doping, and 11% indicated that they were taking something for cognitive doping, and that in some, the total was something, I think it averaged out to about 9%. And the risk factors, or the factors that were associated with an increased likelihood of using something: older athletes older than 39, athletes who'd been competing in sports for more than 10 years, and athletes who were training more than 8 hours. And then athletes who were competing in shorter distance events, which I thought was interesting. Shorter distance events, more training, older, and been in the sport for longer were more associated. And also in this study, it wasn't broken down between men and women, but there are other studies that suggest men are more likely to use substances than women. Juliet, what do we do with all of this?
Yeah.
Again, I know we're not going to spend any time thinking about it, but it's there.
I think that second part about the cognitive doping is a lot murkier than drugs taken to improve physical performance, because then we dance into the realm of, for example, ADHD medication, right? That's methamphetamine, right? And I think that's, I don't know.
I
That
have
seems
less
way
of a problem with
yeah,
that.
that seems way too muddy
I
and
have
way
less
too
of a
much
problem with
overlap
that.
with everything.
Cocaine and
I just don't want to be on a
amphetamines.
bike course next to somebody on cocaine. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, I think if we're talking purely, we do need to differentiate between pro ranks and age group ranks, right? Pro professional, it's a bit of a different story. These people are making a living out of it. There's money to be made. There's sponsorships to be had, et cetera. And so leaving that aside, if we're just talking about age groupers, I guess the way it boils down to me is it's a shame. That's the way I look at it. It's tragic that people out there feel that it's important that age group triathlon is that their performance at age group triathlon is important enough in some sort of self-validation process that they are taking something that eventually is going to hurt them. I just don't understand it. I guess that's the big thing. It's too bad. I feel sad for those people.
It goes back. I think you said two really important things that I'm going to carry with me. Number one is we don't know what's going on in these people's lives, that their psychology is such that they feel they need to do this. And so we need to have some empathy. Yeah. But at the same time, just not going to worry about it, right? It's out there. We know it's out there. I wish it wasn't out there in these numbers because these are pretty high numbers.
They are, yeah.
But it's out there.
Yeah.
I think that the problem is such that, and I continue to refer to it as a problem because I do view it as a problem, not just because it's affecting the results, but also because it's affecting people's lives.
Yeah.
So I think the problem is such that it's useful to bring in an outside perspective. And that's why we're going to extend this topic to cover the entire episode. And so I want to bring in the first of our voices, which is going to be a coach of a professional athlete and a coach of age groupers. And the second of our voices is going to be a professional athlete, someone who everybody here is going to be very familiar with. So let's begin and let's continue the conversation by introducing our first guest on this topic. All right, Juliet, like I said, after our discussion about the research in terms of the prevalence of at least what's been reported about doping in the age groups, I thought that it would be useful to bring in some outside voices to talk about this problem. And the first person I wanted to bring into this conversation is somebody who's been a guest on the podcast before, and that's Jim Vance. Jim is a coach. He coaches Ben Canute, amongst others, and he also has his own coaching. He's also involved with 80/20 endurance. And I knew that Jim would have some insightful kind of perspective on this. And Jim, thanks so much for joining me again here on the TriDoc podcast.
Sure. No, happy to come. It's an interesting topic for sure.
Yeah. And now it's only been, maybe 3-4 weeks since we had the most recent positive in the professional ranks in the form of, why am I blanking on his name again? The Mexican Thomas Rodriguez. Who tested positive and unfortunately he was stripped of his win at Ironman Texas. Working with Ben, I'm sure you guys probably talk about this. How does Ben view a positive like that within the professional ranks? How does it affect him? Is it something that is just completely externalized and he just goes about his business? Or is it something that he acknowledges is just there and there's nothing he can do about it? What's the perspective?
That's a good question. I think your perspective probably changes the more doping busts there are, potentially. So I think everybody first needs to probably be a little fluid in their perspective, or a little flexible and understanding like this is an ever-changing world of sport and circumstance and challenge. So we really all need to pause and do some self-assessment of what our beliefs really are. I've had to do a lot of that myself. I can tell you with Ben, I think for the most part, we don't really talk and dwell on it because it's really out of our control for the most part. And here's the thing. I think no one in the world would say Ben Canute is the most talented athlete to ever see the sport has ever seen. But I think a lot of people would say he's probably one of the few guys in the sport that's come close to maximizing his potential. And so for us, that doesn't change. That really doesn't. And the truth is, just because you dope doesn't mean you can get to a start line healthy. Just because you dope doesn't mean you show up to the start line in the right frame of mind to be able to do that. We've really looked at the totality of our approach and said, let's make sure we show up to the start line healthy, happy, confident, great place, excited to race. And if we do that consistently, then we maximize everything that we can do. And I'd say probably the biggest statistic that I'm most proud of with Ben, which the more research I've done, it's absolutely unheard of at his level, is in 8 years, we've never missed a race start. Once we put a race on the calendar at the start of the year and said, we're going to go to this race, we've never missed a start. That's not to say we've not had some hiccups in training where we've had to back off or anything like that, but we have never missed a race start at the highest level of the sport in 8 years. And there's athletes I know that can't go 8 weeks without an injury or at least some sort of setback. I think as long as we're doing that, we're maximizing. If I have any concerns, I do try and listen to the possibility that some of these could be by mistake, contamination. That is a possibility. I look at Beth McKenzie, a great person in the sport, she got busted and she claimed that it was some sort of, I think one of the salt supplements from back in the day. I'm not even fully sure. I think you look at the way we treated her versus the way we treat other people, maybe that get busted, it may be a little differently. And I think she was believable, maybe because she just hadn't really gone and won some of the big races yet. But it's okay. So again, we got to be fluid here. What is it we really believe? What is it that we really think? Is it that we just don't like people winning and doing it? Like you can do it as long as you don't win? Or, I'm just judging by our reactions as a sport, as a media, and everything. So
yeah, Jim, can you talk a little bit more about that? Because you started this answering Jeff's question by saying I've had to do a little bit of soul searching. I've had to do a little bit of thinking about how I react to news of a professional triathlete doping. You're touching around the edges here, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about what does that look like when you hear about an athlete, whether they have just won something or whether they're middle of the pack. Maybe they've never been on a podium, but they still get busted, whatever. Maybe they don't get busted as often because they're not so much under the magnifying glass. But can you talk a little bit more about your thought process here? Because I think you're right, particularly with social media being what it is, people are very quick to jump all over people. But it sounds like you're not actually that person. So I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, it was interesting. When Thomas got busted, Rodriguez, some people were like, oh, I knew it. Like, messaging me. And I'm just like, I didn't know. I didn't think it was necessarily an outlier. Yes, I just thought the guy must be really good in the heat. And everything that I saw, okay, he's from Mexico. That's a hot place to train. He's probably been raised in that. I don't know his whole history. I can tell you he was one of the guys I was worried about for Kona. Absolutely. He was higher on the list. When he got busted, I was more like, all right, well, I guess we don't have to worry about him now. That honestly was like my thinking. When I say soul searching, so just to be candid here, me personally, I've been through a lot of change in my life. I've battled some anxiety. I've battled imposter syndrome to the point where it was affecting my life quite a bit. My productivity, my relationships, my home life, my parenting styles. And I really had to stop and get some help and even go to medication. I'm on Prozac. Man, what a difference. Goodness, I'm just so much clearer of a person. And it's gotten me to pause and really think about what if Prozac was illegal to take as a performance enhancer? Where would I be in my life right now? Now, I don't really compete anymore because my competitive juices got out when I was younger and I enjoy the competitiveness in coaching, but it makes me wonder if I knew, let's say the best drug you could take, the best performance enhancing drug you could take was Prozac. What would I do? And if I really loved triathlon or I loved competing, would I really have to choose between competing versus a better family life, a better world, a better productivity? What is it that I really want out of sport? What is it that I really want out of life? And me personally, I think we're seeing this prevalence of doping in the age grouping because a lot of people now injecting prescription drugs into your life, and we're finding new ways to solve problems and help people. And I think some people really need to make a decision here too. Okay, what is it that I'm doing triathlon? Am I doing it because I'm competitive and I want to win? Or am I doing it because it's just a healthy outlet and a lifestyle that helps me be better in every other aspect of my life? And I think what we all look at is it's all competitive. It's all competitive. I think the majority of triathletes out there, they may have some competitiveness, but I don't think they're out to try and win. I don't think that just because someone goes and takes some drug that helps them live a better daily life doesn't make them an awful person on the race course.
Yeah, it's an interesting perspective, and I don't have a problem with what you're saying. I think that if you're on something and it just so happens to have performance enhancing effects, then you can get a TUE, and you should. I guess the issue is that there's a lot of these things that are questionable.
Can you though, Jeff? Jeff, let me challenge you on that. Can you get a TE? You can apply for one.
Yeah.
But that doesn't necessarily mean you get it.
You can, if you have a true testosterone's the big one, right? That's going to be for men who are in their late 50s. That's what people are going to be most likely going to be taking. If you have true, the problem is that this whole low T thing is made up. It's a drug company. And I can tell you this as a physician, that low T is not something that existed until testosterone became easy to produce, and then therefore something that drug companies could market.
They made up a problem.
You're not going to get it. Yeah, they made up a problem to solve with a product. You're not going to get a TUE for having low T because low T is not a true defined disease. However, if you have hypogonadism, a true disease where your testosterone levels are at truly low and you need to have testosterone replacement, yeah, you're going to get a TUE for that. I don't think that's going to be a problem. But I think for a lot of these other things, now, you're never going to get a TUE for clomiphene, which is what Thomas Hernandez was busted for. There's no benefits to that. There's no medical, there's not a reason to take that. So you're not wrong to say that it's not like you could just easily apply for a TUE and you're always going to get it. But I think that if you have a true medical issue, I get a beta blockers. I think for age groupers, it's going to happen. I guess I still come back to, if we are going to say, look, we want sport to be clean, and we are saying that, and look, I go back to the studies that we talked about in the earlier segment, which say that 7% of competitors have admitted to taking a substance, not because it was making their life better, but because it was they were taking it specifically to enhance their performance, like EPO. So then what do? Do we just say, okay, that's just the way it is? Or do we try? Because right now in the pros, I think the drug testing is sorely insufficient. And in age groupers, it just doesn't exist. So do we do something about it, or do we just continue to go along in the same path that we're on now?
Let me ask the question in a different way, too. Do we want fairness? Or do we want clean sport? Because they're not the same thing. They're not. And that I think is where people get them mixed up. They think that clean sport means it's fair. It's not. Okay? Because if I can still get a TUE, then is that fair? Even if we consider that clean. And believe it or not, maybe you'll agree with this, maybe you won't agree with this. I don't think the whole transgender in sports argument is much different than the doping. It's really about fairness and level playing field. That's how I perceive it. But I got to ask myself this question. What is the purpose of sport? Is it the end all be all? Is it what do you make a living off it, or do you just participate in it? I think that is another thing. So like in the professional ranks, I'm all about, yes, it's about fairness. It's about clean sport. It's about both. When there's a lot of money on the line, there's titles, there's this and that. We need to level the playing field as much as possible. There's always going to be groups that have more resources than others. That's just the way it is. That's sport. But when we talk about fairness and things, I'll give you an example. We want to take dopers and we want to, what if we went to this Thomas Rodriguez and Colin Chartier and said, we'll give you a 1-year suspension, but you have to become clean, be honest, tell us exactly how you did it. Tell us, and let's move forward. Some people will be like, that's not fair. He cheated and he's still getting the benefits. But if you're for clean sport, You're about, let's figure out how they're cheating and let's cut that off. So is it, I want clean sport or I want fairness?
And the same, that's a really interesting way to differentiate too, because if we're talking about fairness, then you have to think about genetic differences and how much money somebody has and what part of the world they live in and all of these different things, right? And so that's all inherently unfair. So I like the way you're articulating fairness versus clean sport, because that I can wrap my mind around.
Yeah, and I like it as well, because I think you're also highlighting the fact that when I've talked to other people about this, people who are in the sport just to participate, which is the vast majority, they don't care about this nearly as much as the people who are at the pointy end. And Juliet and I just happen to be at the pointy end, and it bothers us a lot because we are constantly thinking about it. Anytime I look at the podium and I look at some of these times, and I think to myself, okay, I know how hard I work and I don't know how that happened, but okay. And it's because there's just this vacuum of just not knowing. And with in Juliet's case, Juliet works super hard and she is beating people below her by quite a lot. And so she is the one that people are looking at and saying, well, nobody's testing her. So is she doing something? So it's this. So we confess that this is a subject that is very close to our heart and may have an outsized, I don't know, what do you think? Rent in our heads?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it bothers us for different reasons. And actually, I think Jeff suspects there may be people who are men who are at his age and above who are getting performance enhancement from testosterone, right? I actually never worry about what women are taking, either because I'm an idiot and I don't think about it, or because in a previous life, I was an Olympic rower and it was before 1990 when the Eastern European system was at its finest. And everybody knew that side of the world was doping and there was nothing we could do about it. So it never bothered. Like it was just not something you're worried about. And I think I've just carried that over. But yeah, it does seem to come up a little bit more often. And I do wonder if it's a little bit different for age group men versus age group women, because I can't imagine, I'm an idiot, but I just don't see age group women taking testosterone.
Who are these drugs marketed to? I can watch TV and see these drugs. I'm not marketing to women. No. Hey, feel more youthful, do this and that. That's for men.
Yeah.
It's absolutely for men, which I come back to it, age grouper, and I can take something and it's going to make me feel a lot better and make me a better husband, a better father, a better worker at my company. But I'm considered a cheater on the race course? That's where, like I say, introspective. We all need to do some assessments. How important is triathlon in your life? How important is triathlon in the world? There are plenty of people that don't give a damn about it. Couldn't name one triathlete on the planet. But yet we vilify some of these people because of the choices they make to better their lives. In the age group ranks. I'm going to put it, I want to clarify that.
Sure.
In no way.
Because we're not doing it for a living. Yeah.
And so like I even look at transgenders in sports. So like I say, I think these are along the same lines. Like someone asked me my thoughts on that. So I'll just share that here. High school. It's ruining high school sports. No, it's not. No one, people do high school sports to learn, to grow, to mature, to build and work as a team and a community toward a goal or whatever. That's the purpose of high school sports, not an NCAA scholarship breeding ground, as most parents want to think and blame this. People look for acceptance. They look for opportunities to be healthy in their lives. I have no problem with transgender kids in high school sports, as long as it's safe. So I do want to put that there, because high school sports are not designed to be this professional breeding ground. That was never its intent. That's not what it's designed for. So people that complain about this. Now, once we go to NCAA, and again, I go back to what I said earlier, I think this is a fluid situation. NIL was not available even just a couple years ago. Now NIL is. So if I'm a top-notch swimmer at an NCAA institution and Leah Thomas is beating me and costing me money, that's a problem. Now I have a problem with it because NIL is different. People are watching this. NCAA has now become a professional sport. That's just the way it is. So I look at it much the same way in the thing like, okay, is money at stake here or is it more about improving lives? If it's about improving lives, I'll be honest, you got to be responsible for your own just choices and your own decisions on what you put in your body and go race and do that. And maybe the problem is we just need to be honest about it. Hey, you're required to check off. Yes, I'm on these things. I'm using X prescriptions or whatever. So now you're not eligible for awards if that's what we want. Okay. Like I don't have a problem with that. But what I do have a problem though with when we vilify people that have taken steps to really prioritize their health and do things to try and be better in every other aspect of their life. And that's for some people that rocks them because they think the competitiveness. Oh, but it's not competitive. It's not fair competitively. Is that really what we're complaining about here?
Jim, that is a far too nuanced view for such a black and white society that we live in. But I really appreciate that. And that's why I asked you to come on today, because it's that kind of nuance that we need to hear. And I'm sure our listeners appreciate it. Jim Vance, thank you so much for joining us from Kona, where he's working with Ben Canute in preparation for the Ironman World Championships, just a short month away. So good luck to Ben, and we will be following and wish him all the best for that.
Good luck, Jim. Good luck.
I thought that was a fascinating conversation with Jim, and now we are going to bring our second guest on, and it is someone that our listeners will be very familiar with, and that is former Canadian Olympian, current professional on the 70.3 circuit, Matt Sharpe. Matt, welcome back to the TriDoc podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Happy to be back and chatting with you and Juliet. It's great.
So, Matt, Jim mentioned a couple of things about doping in sport. And one of the things he said that I thought that Juliet and I both thought was really interesting is he made this distinction between can the sport be, or should the sport be clean or should it be fair? And I think what he was kind of saying, and Juliet, correct me if I'm wrong, but basically he was saying we can clean up the sport by just purging the sport of all the dopers, which would make things clean. But is that necessarily fair? Alternatively, he says, look, we can go to the Colin Chartiers, to the Thomas Rodriguez's of the world, and we could say to them, look, we're going to give you a 1-year ban, but in order to have that 1-year ban, you've got to spill the beans on everything you've done, everyone you might have been associated with. And if you do that, then we'll let you back into the sport in a year and you can compete then. Now, that would be potentially viewed as fair to some people, potentially unfair by others. It would certainly go a long way to cleaning up the sport. I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, that's a very interesting take. It's like when they get these criminals and they use them to get the bigger fish, right? So maybe that's the whole premise behind that. I think that's an interesting perspective. And I think that's maybe, a road they can go down potentially is obviously using these athletes who they caught and understanding, maybe if there's bigger systemic folks or whoever that they can nab, that it will eventually obviously trickle down to a more cleaner race. I think at the end of the day, why do we do anti-doping testing? I think from what I understand and my perspective is you're just trying to prevent people from ingesting substances that could ultimately like really hurt or kill them taken at a certain level. There's the whole obviously clean sport aspect. At the end of the day, not everyone's starting on the same footing in terms of resources and stuff. So it's not that we're trying to make everybody on the same footing. It's more just, trying to prevent people from really hurting themselves and potentially dying. That's my thought on that.
That's a really interesting kind of take. And Jim mentioned that too, or actually you and Jim, when you were talking, Juliet, you talked about that idea that not everybody's starting at a fair level playing field anyways. Right?
Yeah, this is exactly right. If you're looking at the conversation that we had at the end of speaking with Jim was, you're absolutely right, Matt. There are so many factors that come into play. If we want to make sport completely fair, you do have to think about genetic factors, resources, where somebody lives, how much time they have to train. All of those things could potentially create an unfair playing field. And so this is just one more of those factors. So you've articulated it really well.
Matt, in your experience, or obviously not your experience, but in your assessment as you've now been on the pro circuit for almost 2 seasons, do you get a sense that this is 10% of age groupers admitting to using some kind of performance enhancing substance? That's a tremendously large number, especially for people who are not invested in it's not their livelihoods. Do you think that number is outsized compared to what might be going on in the pros, or is it maybe similar?
I feel like personally, we all know incentives drive behavior. But in this case, I don't know. Personally, I don't know if it'd be 10% in the pro field. I know obviously not 10% of the pro athletes are getting tested all the time, but there's always at these races, if you're a top finisher, you're probably going to get a random drug test or something. So I think, whereas with age group racing, I think we all know there's definitely a lack of testing and consistent testing. So I think at least for the pros, having this someone or entity over your shoulder a little bit, it helps, I think, just keep people away from doing that kind of stuff to some degree. So I don't think personally 10% of the pro field is doping, but it's definitely probably a little bit more than I would like to think for sure.
Not zero, but not 10%. Juliet, was that your experience as well when you were training for the Olympics? Was there always this thought that USADA was there and therefore I have to be super strict about being careful what's going into my body?
It was definitely a different era. It was a little bit ridiculous, right? Because on the one hand, I remember we all had this huge meeting before we went over to the Olympics, and we were told all the things we couldn't take, which included too much caffeine, or there were certain types of birth control and all of these things, so we all were wandering around with our tea bags worrying that we were having too much caffeine. And yet we knew on the other side of the Iron Curtain, all of those athletes who were in state-sponsored systems, which absolutely used drugs a lot worse than caffeine. I don't think any of us worried about it too much because we're all totally clean. It just wasn't, at least within American rowing, it just wasn't a factor. It wasn't a conversation. It just wasn't a thing. But we also knew it was a thing elsewhere. And again, as we talked about this earlier on this podcast, there's nothing we could do about it, so we didn't worry about it. But I am really curious to hear from Matt. He's had the experience of both being Olympian and now racing on the pro circuit at a 70.3 distance. Do you feel, and of course, these are totally different governing bodies and different testing systems and everything else. Do you feel like there might be, if there is doping happening out there among these world-class triathletes, do you feel like there might be more in the Olympics than in the pro ranks or vice versa? Do you have any sense for that whatsoever?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think basically, for me, the more testing you have, I would say the less likely you're going to have potential dopers, just because there's, more potential to get caught. So to me, World Triathlon is the gold standard of athlete testing, drug testing within triathlon, and then everybody else. I think Ironman's probably second in that regard. Even from kind of those development races, Continental Cups, junior races, like there is random race day testing. Whereas honestly, in a lot of these Ironman races, maybe not pro series ones, like sometimes there just isn't really testing at all, or maybe one person versus the entire podium. So I think, in terms of if you're going to look for dopers, I think it's probably more likely that there's some in the Ironman long course world. Don't want to say just Ironman because it's long course versus World Triathlon. Because to be honest,
sure,
like I understand Ironman does have decent anti-doping program. I don't know if Challenge has one. I haven't done any Challenge races, so I have no idea, but they're a little different. I would think they probably, in a way, piggyback off Ironman T100 was trying to do.
I don't think a lot of us age groupers really know, a lot of our listeners really know what that testing looks like, because we're never tested, right? And can you speak just for a minute to what does it look like for the Olympics field? We just had the Paris Olympics. Like, were all those athletes tested? Will they do just the podium finishers plus maybe 5 more who they pick at random? And then what does Ironman do? We can listen to a podcast or watch a vlog, and maybe a pro athlete will mention, oh yeah, I had to go to drug testing, or drug testing showed up at my door. But we don't know, how does this work? How does it work with both of those systems?
At some point in your career, I think when I started getting on the podium at World Cup races and stuff in World Triathlon, you get flagged as like a, top performing athlete or whatever, and you get put in this testing pool. And Ironman would have a testing pool as well of athletes. And I think that's actually publicly available. I don't know how many athletes are on there. I think just basically the testing pool for World Triathlon athletes is a lot more than Ironman. That's my thoughts. But basically, when you're in that pool, you are subjected to out of competition testing, not just in competition, but out of competition as well. And that's where, you ever heard of athletes talking about their whereabouts or talking about random drug testers showing up at their homes. That's what this is like. So for many years, I was in that testing pool, registered testing pool, I think they call it. And basically every quarter, I would submit my whereabouts, not exactly in terms of like where I was going to be perfectly, but because I could go in and change it when I needed to. But you basically give these anti-doping authorities idea of where you're going to be for 1 hour every single day of the year. And it's great because obviously you need to be doing a good job of that. And sometimes you hear about athletes having a positive drug test or positive kind of filing, even though they didn't actually test positive for drugs, but they missed, I think it's 3 of these random out of competition tests. I guess in that situation,
Okay.
yeah, the athletes were ducking the test. So it's guilt by, I don't know, not being tested. But yeah, so and then obviously in competition, anybody can be tested if you're in the race. But otherwise, if you're a top performing athlete, you're flagged, you're going to have to give your whereabouts 1 hour every single day of the year. And then when you also, there's the opportunity to test it in competition. And there's different substances that are legal in and out of competition, but that's the gist of it for sure.
If you could wave a magic wand and fix things, would it just be to increase the testing pool and increase the frequency of testing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the more testing you do, the more likelihood you're going to catch folks. Famously, obviously, Lance Armstrong said he never failed a drug test while he was clearly taking a lot of drugs. In some ways, it's not perfect, but I think just having more testing gives you more opportunity. The problem with all that is it costs money. Somebody's got to pay for this testing. And I think we saw with the T100 triathlon series, when they were coming onto the scene, they said they wanted to have a world-class anti-doping program. And then as it turned out a year or so later-ish, they really had no anti-doping program. They had tests at races, but they had no out-of-competition testing for their athletes. Hence the Colin Chartier incident, which I think was a test from Ironman that got him. So it's just at the end for the T100, it cost them money. And I guess they weren't willing to put in the money. And so World Triathlon now runs the T100 anti-doping program. They're a part of the World Triathlon testing pool. And I don't know who pays for that. Maybe World Triathlon does. Who knows? But at the end of the day, yeah, it takes money. And if they're only willing to put a certain amount in, you're only going to get a certain amount of tests. And that's just the reality.
Now, I know we had you here to talk principally about the professional field and what doping or the anti-doping process looks like. But if you could, I'd be interested in just your comments or your thoughts on this notion that as many as 10% is probably overstating things, but let's just stick with the 10% number just for now. And what are your thoughts when you hear that as many as 10% of age groupers may be taking something to to improve their physical performance in triathlon?
It's a little concerning for sure, obviously, because most of these people aren't getting tested. And like I talked about earlier, at the end of the day, you don't want people taking these substances willy-nilly and throwing their actual health into jeopardy. So that's definitely concerning. I think Jim's point about these athletes trying to just be able to work harder or whatever. I actually had that in my newsletter, The Tempo, kind of put a question about, do people think the age group doping is out of control or whatever? And somebody made the point, yeah, okay, if these substances, whatever it may be, if it can help me stay healthier, stay moving for longer in my life, like maybe it makes sense to take those. And that definitely gave me pause, because at the end of the day, we want our society and athletes and everyone moving as well as they can for as long as they can. So it's it brings nuance to this whole debate. Maybe, okay, if these people are obviously taking quote unquote performance enhancing drugs, but obviously in a safe and healthy way, then ultimately they're going to be healthier for longer in their lives. It's something like, hey, like is that a net positive? It sounds like it is to me.
It's a real conundrum. And I have to say, my attitude has changed since we've been recording this segment. Matt, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. I always appreciate having you here and getting your insights. I understand that you have a race coming up in a couple of weeks in Michigan. We will be wishing you the best for that and following yours and, of course, Kirsten's exploits in the Super Tri League as she continues her races. She's racing in London coming up. Is that right?
Yeah, London this weekend. She already raced in Boston and Chicago. And then I think the next one after London for her is going to be the grand final in Neom, Saudi Arabia. So that's a bit of a trip.
Ooh. Okay.
Wow.
Wow.
Very cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, Matt Sharpe, the editor of the Tempo News. If you're not a subscriber, you really should be. It's an awesome read twice a week.
Thanks,
And
Jeff.
of course, a professional triathlete on the 70.3 circuit. Thanks for being here, Matt.
No worries. Thanks for having me, gang.
I don't know about you, Juliet, but I'm coming out of this episode feeling very differently than I was going in.
Yeah. So I think that what our guests have offered us is just a couple of different perspectives on ways to look at it. I don't know if the needle has been moved as far for me as maybe for you, because I was already a little bit more of a shrug my shoulders. Wow, too bad. But these are choices that individuals make and it doesn't bother me that much. And maybe I think you've come a little bit further along the spectrum than that.
Yeah, I think I was really affected by what Jim said about this notion of people taking medications to enhance their life. And if that just so happens to give them a performance benefit. What I don't like about it, though, is if they know they're getting a performance benefit, then should they be competing? I want them to be able to participate, but should they be competing? Because it's not a level field. And I also totally get this whole idea that, you know what, we're not on a level field.
Right.
Obviously, I have resources, I have time, and that's not true for everybody. But just very coincidentally, after I recorded the episode with Michael Erickson and we talked a little bit about doping, somebody reached out to me just this week, an athlete who's an age group athlete in Poland who tells me that he has hypogonadism. And so he has to take testosterone, both in order to be able to have a normal life because he's constantly disabled because of his lack of testosterone, which is a natural thing for him, but also because he wants to have children. And when his testosterone level was so low, he wasn't producing enough sperm.
Sure.
Now that he's on testosterone's replacement, his levels are higher and he's feeling much more vibrant and he's able to do all the things. However, we were having a back and forth dialogue, myself and this person. And I said to him, look, you have a legitimate reason to be taking this. I feel like you should be allowed to participate. I think that if you need a TUE, you should be able to get it. But I do feel that if your levels, because of the medication you're taking, are significantly higher than they would be otherwise, then maybe you shouldn't be competing for awards. And we went back and forth a little bit because he wrote me and he said, the problem is levels are not really widely accepted. It's hard to know. And am I performing at a higher level now that I'm taking testosterone replacement than I was before? Of course, because before I didn't have any. So a case like that is exactly this kind of nuance, right? And I don't really know what to do with that.
And we're getting into a larger topic here, which is maybe a whole nother podcast series about who gets to decide what a normal testosterone level is, whether it's in a man or in a woman for that matter, because there's been a lot discussed about that even in the most recent Olympics. And so it gets very gray and fuzzy. But I think that one of the things that was articulated well for us during these conversations was the whole concept of fair versus clean sport. And how, as you mentioned just a moment ago, the whole level playing field already doesn't exist because of factors that are out there, resources, genetics, time available, where you live, et cetera. And so I think that is a worthwhile way to define this. If we want safe sport, it's one thing. If we want fairness, it's a completely different conversation because fairness is very difficult to define because it's so not monocausal, right? It's just, there's so many factors there.
I think the one thing I will say just to finish this, and that kind of comes back to Joe Wilson, who was somewhat upset by what he saw with this Roth thing. And that really is the question in the survey. And that is, are you knowingly taking something to enhance your performance? And remember, a lot of those people are knowingly taking these medications, not like this athlete who reached out to me, who's taking it because he needs it for a medical condition, but knowingly taking it because they're taking EPO or they're taking testosterone because they're looking for a performance boost. And that remains problematic.
I agree.
And that I don't know what to do about it. Clearly, like Matt said, more testing, but we're not seeing any at the age group level. And we're still left with the problem that we mentioned very early on, which is in the absence of testing, we just have this continuous kind of suspicion. We're left right back where we started from, but with a lot of very interesting conversation in between and a lot to chew on and a lot to think about. What do you think? We really want to know. I think this has been a fascinating subject and a fascinating episode. I hope that you have enjoyed it, and I hope that you will send us your comments. You can email them to me at tri_doc@icloud.com, or you can start a conversation in the private TriDoc Podcast Facebook group. If you're not a member, please look for TriDoc Podcast on Facebook. Answer the 3 easy questions. I'll grant you admittance. You can join the conversation there. And of course, you can submit your own questions that we would consider for answering on the medical mailbag in a future episode. Juliet, thank you again. This has been a great, I think, conversation, episode-long conversation, and we will get back to our usual kind of segment the next time out in a couple of weeks.
Thanks so much, Jeff. This has been really interesting.
Hi, my name is Justin Rayfield. I'm a proud Patreon supporter of the TriDoc Podcast, the only show that's more addictive than carbs before a long workout. Produced and edited by the one and only Jeff Sankoff, along with this dynamic duo of interns, Cosette Rhodes and Nina Takashima, who are so amazing they make superheroes look like they're on a coffee break. If you're looking for the scoop on all things discussed today, dash over to www.tridocpodcast.com for show notes and a treasure trove of past episodes. Got a burning question that's keeping you up at night? Or maybe just something you're curious about? Fire off an email to Jeff at try_doc@icloud.com. And who knows, your question might just be the star of a future episode. If you're on the hunt for coaching services that'll make you faster than a greased lightning bolt, zip on over to try.coaching.com or lifesportcoaching.com. Trust me, it's like finding a shortcut in a May. You'll thank me later. Lastly, don't just stalk your ex on social media. Follow Jeff too. Catch all the action on the TriDoc Podcast Facebook page. Double tap those pics on TriDoc Coaching Instagram and binge watch the TriDoc Coaching YouTube channel. And hey, why not join the cool kids in the TriDoc Podcast private Facebook group? Just search, click, and you're in. If this podcast tickles your funny bone or pumps up your adrenaline, show some love with a rating and review. Subscribe to never miss out on the fun. If you're feeling extra generous, become a Patreon Thane of Podcast at patreon.com/TriDoc Podcast. And lastly, I want to give a big shout out to Radio by Empty Hours for the killer intro and outro music, used with a high five and a thank you. Discover them and other indie gems at www.reverbnation.com and support little guys making big waves. The TriDoc Podcast will be back on faster than you can say, is it race day yet? With more medical music and another chat with a multi-sport maven. Until then, train like a beast and enjoy the podcast.